I was one of about 1,000 audience members crowded into a downtown auditorium in Louisville, Kentucky, about 35 years ago to hear the famous author and psychiatrist M. Scott Peck. His book, The Road Less Traveled, has sold more than 7 million copies, which made everything else that he ever wrote an instant bestseller, both the good and the bad. But he was an amazingly influential author in spite of his pretty messed up personal life, and still, knowing as much as I do about his rather narcissistic self-indulgence, I would still say that if you're only going to read one book before you die, you should probably still read The Road Less Traveled. We could just all wish that Scott Peck had taken more of his own advice. But I was clearly not the only fan in the room that day in the middle of the 1980s as we all leaned forward to take in every word that he uttered. When it came time for the Q&A after his talk, one of the therapists in the room asked Peck to speak to a term that had just recently been coined but immediately became very popular, the dysfunctional family. Peck looked around the gathered assembly and asked for a show of hands of people who had grown up in a dysfunctional family, and I swear I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that you could literally feel the breeze in the room as 1,000 people simultaneously raised their hands. And Peck observed, if the term refers to everyone, it's not a diagnosis, it's just a description of the human condition. As going to therapy became more popular and frankly something almost mandatory among the more educated, those of us who were in the family counseling field came up with a few helpful proverbs as we encouraged one another and our clients. Previous generations used to go to their priest to confess their sins. This generation is determined to go to their therapist to confess their parents' sins. Somewhere between denial of your family of origin's deficits and a complete repudiation of any personal responsibility by placing all of the blame for anything that's gone wrong in your otherwise rather cushy life on your parents, there has to be some sane balance. I received my education in pastoral counseling during my years at the Southern Ivy League School of Vanderbilt University, what those of us in Kentucky and Tennessee called the Harvard of the South. The classism of the perspective from which I was taught counseling in that expensive school showed up quickly in my first clinical placement in a mental health office in Kentucky, where the older therapist assigned to me virtually every court-ordered case of people who were often mentally challenged, violent, and substance abusing. Not the sort of people I had been trained to use reflective, client-centered listening techniques to help them, to raise them above the guilt feelings their mother had burdened them with. I realized that some of what I'd been told as absolutes may have worked for the sweet-smelling aristocracy, but it wasn't true in the country roads of rural Kentucky. One of the things I told myself about self-actualization was that no one could ever fully accept themselves until they had entirely forgiven and accepted their parents. That was sort of an assumption in the universe of counseling that I was in at the time. But that sort of truth is what lies behind the most insipid observation I've ever heard being given to people who really did have major issues in their family of origin. And I have heard it repeated 1,000 times. Well, your parents did the best that they could. That, my friends, is absolutely not a universal truth. Lots of parents really sucked at being parents. And what is more, they knew that they sucked and still failed to provide for their children. And they especially knew that they sucked when they abused their children physically, sexually, or psychologically. As I mentioned in my last talk, my own parents they had issues. They held on to a lot of their own hillbilly past with a lot of racial prejudices and a fairly irrational fear of anything that they did not immediately understand, which included homosexuality, Jews, Catholics, and virtually all foreigners. That gave me stuff to talk about in my weekly meetings when I was being trained and I had to meet with a counseling supervisor. It let me air all of that junk that I needed to rise above from my own hillbilly background. But most of the families I saw in that mental health clinic in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and most of the people I've had to give a lot of my time and attention to after that first clinical placement, were dealing with things for which their parents maybe don't deserve to be forgiven. And they shouldn't just be granted carte blanche acceptance. I realized that my attitudes about my own family were different from a lot of my peers in college, many of whom constantly talked about being homesick, or they became absolutely giddy when it was time to jump in the car and drive home for Thanksgiving or Christmas. I usually went home for the holidays as long as my parents were living, but it was often more of a trip to be endured than it was something to look forward to. But for those who had been sexually molested, who had been seriously beaten, or who had been forced to work like slaves in a family farm, or who had been subjected to the violence and deprivations of poverty, especially when that poverty was caused by a mother or father's addiction or mental illness. Those holidays were often nightmare scenarios. I'm bringing this up on the Sunday after Thanksgiving when many of you will have just made that journey home, which Garrison Keillor so accurately described once as being holiday guilt trips. If you're one of the lucky ones for whom a holiday family reunion is all warm and fuzzy, that's great, and we're all happy for you. But this sermon is not for you. You should be aware that for most of the people around you, this holiday was not undiluted joy. A lot of people you know did not have a Norman Rockwell holiday, and it may in fact have looked more like an episode of Breaking Bad. I've known people who grew up in pretty normal homes with only mild degrees of neurotic issues, and yet they complained about their parents obsessively. And I have known people who really should have been taken from their family of origin and placed in a safer foster home, who were so brainwashed by the insanity of their home life that they continue to insist upon heaping love and praise on people who probably should be in jail for the ways that they abuse their children. To all of you, there are some things that I want to say today very clearly. You own your own story. As the famous author Anne Lamott once tweeted, you own everything that ever happened to you. So tell your stories. If people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. Parents who think of their children as being nothing more than extensions of themselves assume that they own their children's lives, and they can reward them with love or punish them with rejection to demand their conformity. These parents have worked hard to prevent their children from ever having a sense of appropriate boundaries, of what's your business and what's not your business, the awareness that they own their own lives, and that they can be different from their parents and not only survive, they don't even have to feel guilty. Another book that I've recommended to literally hundreds of women over the past 40 years is My Mother, Myself by the Freudian psychiatrist, the late Nancy Friday. Though this book has proven to be so invaluable, it has, even to this date, I will occasionally ask female therapists if they found a better book to recommend to women who have issues struggling to find a separation from their mothers. That book's been in print for 2 generations, and it is still being used in classes and in therapy. But I don't think it's just for women. One of the issues that Friday discusses at length is the whole issue of symbiosis in sick families. For those parents, family love only happens when their children are exactly like them. If they dare to differ from them in politics, in religion, in who they love, or in how they raise their children, this is experienced by those parents as rejection, or literally as hatred. Even in very recent years, we've had church members who had escaped the mental prison of their parents' religion, but even as adults with children of their own, they felt that they had to protect their parents from ever knowing that they no longer attended Catholic Mass or went to an Assemblies of God charismatic church. And in this past decade, as politics has become so vitriolic and divisive, if your Fox News watching family members find out that you've got 8 or 9 Bernie Sanders signs in your yard, or as in my case, a dozen with extra light-up signs in the kitchen window and along the fence line, asking the question, what's so wrong with socialism? Well, that can make Thanksgiving very tense. Alcoholics, drug addicts, people with borderline personality disorders and narcissists all tend to create an alternative reality into which they try to force their family members, and especially their children. But hear me, you don't have to play along. You can be honest about your family. You can be open about the abuse that you've experienced. You can tell your story. You can publish your stories if it seems important to you to do so. Now, I've always tried to err on the side of being generous and understanding, but you folks should know this. You don't have to lie or keep sordid secrets for anyone. If someone abuses you and they expect you to keep it a secret to protect their reputation, that's crazy and you know it. This is not about revenge. This is not about retaliation. This is about establishing boundaries and taking charge of your own life. In fact, I encourage you not to harbor resentments or even fantasies of hurting them back. Trust me, it will be plenty painful for them if you just start living your life as if you owned it and maintaining appropriate boundaries. Your mother cannot make you feel guilty unless you agree to feel guilty when she tries to provoke you. You may have been trained for years to be manipulated by guilt, but that can stop whenever you're ready for it to end. Your father can't tell you what to think, how to dress, where to work, who to love, or how to vote, and if you make that boundary perfectly clear, it will literally help him to become a more healthy father. We had a saying in family therapy back in the 80s, no one ever goes crazy alone, they always have company. You cannot change your mother, your father, your children, or any of your siblings or extended family, but you can change yourself. You can choose to become more healthy. And when you do, and you find that they have to interact with you as a healthy person rather than the cowering victim they may have trained you to be, then they have to get more healthy or at least act like it to even be able to have a conversation with you. When we try to look at family systems, it's something like looking at the balls on a billiard table. If one ball changes position, it necessarily changes the position of the other balls on the table. If it's not moving, if it's not changing, if it's not growing, not taking ownership of your own life, that's what allows everything to stay just as it has always been. We always tell the family members of alcoholics and drug addicts that if you pretend to believe their lies, if you agree to enter into their universe of insanity, then you are literally enabling them to continue to lead an addicted life. Parents know that they have to teach their babies how to walk, how to talk, how to eat, how to dress themselves, but too often they assume that they must also teach them what to believe and how to think and how to live. It's one thing to teach your kids to balance their checkbooks, to warn them about the pitfalls of bad credit, and what to do to maintain their car. It is another to insist that their religion has to be your religion, or your political views must also be theirs, that they must somehow be a carbon copy of your values and your preferences. Otherwise, they're no longer part of your family. As the famous sociologist from the early part of the last century, Margaret Mead, said so prophetically, children must be taught how to think, but not what to think. Your family cannot tell you what to believe, or how to vote, or who to love, or what to think, and you have to see that you also cannot tell your children or grandchildren what to think, what religion they must be, or how they will form a loving family of their own. I know that for a whole lot of people, family really is just another F word. It was a source of pain, fear, guilt, and a longing to be loved that was never satisfied, so that you ended up accepting a kind of mind control so that you can belong, so that you can fit in. And even when you become aware of how you've been manipulated, conditioned, victimized, or controlled, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll ever be able to get the kind of love that you want from your family. If I may reference M. Scott Peck once more, Peck insisted that it is our job to move the ball of evolution farther down the field. Your family of origin may have had issues that you just can't fix. You can never go back in time. You can never relive that part of your life with better choices or a more healthy awareness. You can, however, be honest about what you've experienced that has made you who you are today. You can try to improve the quality of your family relationships to the extent that the other members of your family are willing to play along, to evolve as well, recognizing that they may not even be remotely interested in changing at all. I always advise my counseling clients to do a little bit more than the estranged family member. Don't do everything. Don't just constantly throw yourself at their feet. But send a card, birthdays, anniversaries. Remember special times in their life. Include them in correspondence. But don't do a lot more than they do. Leave them a little hungry for some new contact, because if you grovel, then they've already got you. But what I think that we all owe to our children and grandchildren, what we owe to the society as a whole, is to take what we received in our family of origin and to improve upon it. I worked hard not to pass on to my daughter the kind of irrational prejudices that were a part of my family inheritance, but I did try to pass along the positive traits I saw in my family, of honesty, of personal responsibility, of compassion, and a serious work ethic. I didn't want for her to have to get over the neurotic guilt and self-condemnation that was a part of my family's religious beliefs, but I also had to hold my tongue as she explored spiritual options that I certainly would not have chosen for her. I also had to hold my tongue when she was in a serious relationship with a wealthy Wall Street guy until she learned on her own that being rich doesn't make you a good person. I could have saved her a couple of years, but the right answer for me was to just tell her that I will learn to love anyone that she chooses to love, while I hold out some hope that she will choose more of a Gandhi than a Gordon Gekko. None of us will get it all right. I doubt that many people ever tried harder than I did to be a good father. And I think I did okay, but I know that I didn't do the best that I could, that horrible thing that people like to say. I can remember many times when I chose my own interests over hers. I wish I could go back and be a better father. Still, I know that basically I did my job, which was to do better than my parents did, and now the ball is literally in her hands to see if she can improve upon her family of origin, which I feel certain that she will. Thanksgiving is behind us now. I am wishing you an even better, more loving, or maybe just a more healthy Christmas celebration for you and for your clan.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.